The Velithri Dominion had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. Their empire covered 900 star systems, and their warships numbered in the tens of thousands. They were tall creatures with gray skin and 4 arms, and they believed themselves to be the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced. When their deep space scanners first detected the small blue planet called Earth, they studied its inhabitants with cold interest. The humans were soft creatures made of flesh and bone. They lived short lives of barely 100 years. They needed oxygen to breathe and water to drink. To the Velithri, these beings seemed pathetic and weak. Admiral Kethvoran was one of the most decorated commanders in the Dominion fleet. He had conquered 17 species in his long career, and had never known defeat. When the Velithri High Council decided to expand their territory into the region humans called the Orion Spur, Kethvoran was given command of the operation. He did not expect any real resistance. His intelligence officers had studied human civilization for decades and concluded that these creatures were barely worth conquering. They had small ships and primitive weapons. They talked endlessly about peace and diplomacy. They were, in the Admiral's opinion, nothing more than prey animals who had somehow learned to build starships. The attack came without warning on a spring morning by Earth's calendar. 3 human colony worlds on the outer edge of their territory received no demands and no ultimatums. Velithri warships simply appeared in orbit and began their bombardment. The cities burned. The forests turned to ash. The oceans boiled under the heat of plasma weapons that had destroyed 100 civilizations before. 40 million human beings died in less than 6 hours. Men and women and children, all reduced to nothing because an alien admiral wanted to teach a weak species its place in the galaxy. Commander Daniel Hayes received the news while standing on the bridge of the Terran Defense Navy vessel Resolute. He was a tall man, with gray eyes and dark hair that was beginning to show streaks of white at the temples. He had served in the fleet for 22 years and had seen many terrible things, but the images coming through on his display screen made his blood run cold. He watched cities he had visited reduced to craters. He saw the faces of the dead scrolling past in an endless stream of casualty reports. His hands gripped the railing in front of him so hard that his knuckles turned white. Lieutenant Commander Catherine Moore stood beside him. She was his executive officer and had been his friend for nearly a decade. Her face was pale as she watched the same footage. When she spoke, her voice was tight with a fury that she was struggling to control. She told Daniel that the Velithri were broadcasting messages across all channels. They were calling the attack a mercy. They were saying that they had done humanity a favor by culling a species too weak to survive in a dangerous galaxy. They were laughing at the dead. Daniel said nothing for a long moment. He thought about his sister who lived on one of the destroyed colonies. He thought about her husband and their 2 young children. He did not know yet if they were among the dead, but the odds were not in their favor. He thought about all the times humanity had chosen peace when they could have chosen war. He thought about the treaties they had signed and the compromises they had made. The Velithri had mistaken all of that for weakness. They had looked at human restraint and seen only fear. On the moon called Luna, Fleet Admiral Gregory Santos stood in the command center of Terran Defense Headquarters. He was an older man with a weathered face and calm eyes that had seen too much death over the years. Around him, officers and analysts worked frantically to assess the damage and coordinate rescue operations for any survivors on the attacked worlds. The numbers were grim. The Velithri had been thorough in their destruction. They had not come to conquer. They had come to exterminate. Gregory received a secure communication from the United Earth Council. The leaders of humanity had met in emergency session and reached a unanimous decision in less than an hour. For 200 years, Earth had maintained a policy of peace and quiet preparation. They had smiled at alien ambassadors and signed trade agreements while secretly building something in the shadows. They had hoped it would never be needed. They had prayed that the galaxy would prove kinder than human history suggested it would be. Those prayers had gone unanswered. The order was simple: mobilize everything. Gregory closed his eyes for just a moment. He thought about what was coming and what it would mean for humanity and for the galaxy. There would be no going back after this. The secret they had kept for 2 centuries would be revealed, and the universe would never look at the human race the same way again. He opened his eyes and began issuing commands. Across human space, the message spread through secure channels. On Earth, officers who had waited their entire careers for this moment received their activation codes. On Mars, massive doors that had been sealed for decades began to open. In the asteroid belts, facilities that appeared to be mining operations revealed their true purpose. On distant moons and hidden stations, lights flickered to life in shipyards that most humans did not even know existed. Daniel Hayes received his orders aboard the Resolute. He read them twice to make sure he understood. Then he turned to Catherine and told her to set a course for Titan Station. She asked what was at Titan Station. He told her that she would see soon enough. He told her that everyone would see. In the halls of the Velethri High Council, Admiral Kethvaran received congratulations for his successful operation. The council members praised his efficiency and his brutality. They discussed which human worlds to target next and how quickly they could absorb the remaining human territory into their empire. They laughed about the primitive species that had dared to exist in their space. They had no idea what they had awakened. Humanity had survived ice ages and plagues. They had survived wars that killed hundreds of millions of their own kind. They had survived meteor strikes and famines and disasters that would have ended most species. They had learned long ago that the universe was not kind to the weak. They had also learned that sometimes the best way to survive was to let your enemies underestimate you. The Velethri thought they were dealing with fragile creatures who would break at the first sign of pressure. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The gathering storm had begun, and it would shake the stars themselves. Captain Samantha Ellis had served in the Terran Defense Navy for 15 years. She was a woman of average height, with short brown hair and steady hands that never shook even in the worst situations. She had commanded the Dreadnought Valiant for 3 years, and believed she knew everything there was to know about human military capabilities. She was wrong. Her ship arrived at Titan Station following emergency orders from Fleet Command. Titan was the largest moon of Saturn, a frozen world of orange haze and methane lakes. Samantha had visited many times before and knew it primarily as a refueling depot and scientific outpost. Nothing she had seen there had prepared her for what she was about to witness. The Valiant took up position near an observation platform, and Samantha watched through the main viewport as something impossible began to happen. The surface of Titan was opening. Massive sections of what she had always believed to be natural terrain were sliding apart to reveal artificial structures beneath. Shipyard bays, the size of small countries, were emerging from underground facilities that must have taken decades to construct. And from those bays, ships were rising. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of warships. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Price stood beside her. He was a younger officer with sharp features and a quick mind. He had been her executive officer for 2 years and had never seen her look surprised by anything. Now her face showed an expression of pure astonishment. He asked her what they were looking at. She told him she had no idea. A communication came through from Fleet Admiral Gregory Santos. His voice was calm and measured as he explained what Samantha and her crew were witnessing. For 150 years, humanity had been building a secret fleet. Every generation had contributed to the project. Resources had been quietly diverted from 1,000 sources. Engineers and workers had lived and died in these hidden facilities, dedicating their lives to a project they hoped would never be needed. The result was the largest armada the galaxy had ever seen. Samantha asked the question that was burning in her mind. She asked how many ships there were. Gregory told her the number was 487,000 dreadnoughts. Each one was larger and more powerful than anything the Velethri possessed. Each one was crewed by officers who had trained their entire lives for this moment. And there were also support vessels, carriers, destroyers, and medical ships. The total number of combat-capable vessels exceeded 700,000. Nathan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. He said the number out loud as if he could not believe it. The entire Velethri Dominion fleet numbered around 60,000 ships. Humanity had built more than 10 times that number in secret, waiting for the day when they would have no choice but to use them. Samantha thought about what this meant. She thought about the generations of men and women who had worked on this project without recognition or thanks. She thought about the leaders who had made the decision to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. She thought about the alien species who had looked at humanity and seen only weakness. Those species had no idea what was coming. On Earth, President Caroline Webb addressed a global audience. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a voice that carried the weight of terrible decisions. She stood in front of the United Nations building and spoke to every human being who could hear her words. She explained what the Velethri had done. She showed images of the destroyed colonies and read the names of the dead. She did not cry, though many who watched her did. Then she explained what humanity was going to do in response. She said that for 2 centuries, Earth had chosen peace. They had extended friendship to every alien species they encountered. They had signed treaties and honored agreements. They had hoped that the galaxy would accept them as equals. That hope was now dead, buried under the ashes of 40 million innocent people. Caroline told the watching universe that humanity would not become conquerors. They would not commit genocide or enslave defeated peoples. But they would defend themselves with every weapon at their disposal. They would show the Velethri and everyone else what happened when you pushed the human race too far. She asked for no permission and offered no apologies. Her people had been murdered, and she intended to answer that murder with overwhelming force. Across human space, the hidden fleets emerged from their concealment. Ships rose from the moons of Jupiter and the asteroids of the belt. They came from facilities buried under the ice of Europa and carved into the rocks of distant planetoids. They had names that spoke of human determination, defiance, perseverance, indomitable, unyielding. These were vessels built by a species that refused to die. Commander Daniel Hayes watched from the bridge of the Resolute as the armada gathered. His ship was small compared to the massive dreadnoughts joining the fleet. But he and his crew would still have a role to play. He thought about his sister and her family. He had received word that they were among the dead on the colony world of New Boston. There would be time to mourn later. For now, there was work to do. Catherine Moore reported that all ships were receiving their orders. The fleet would be divided into task forces, each one large enough to overwhelm any opposition the Velethri could muster. The first target would be the enemy staging areas on the border of human space. From there, they would advance into Velethri territory and destroy every military installation they found. The war would be fast and brutal, and it would end only when the enemy no longer had the ability to threaten humanity again. The crews of the great ships prepared for battle. Men and women checked their weapons and said prayers to whatever gods they believed in. Some wrote letters to loved ones that might never be sent. Others simply sat in silence and thought about what was coming. They were not eager for war. They did not celebrate the death that was about to follow. But they were ready to do what needed to be done. Fleet Admiral Gregory Santos gave the final order. 500,000 dreadnoughts and hundreds of thousands of support vessels activated their fold drives. The technology allowed them to bend space itself and travel vast distances in moments. One by one, the ships of the Terran Armada vanished from human space and reappeared in the territory of their enemies. The giant had awakened, and the galaxy would tremble at its footsteps. Admiral Keth Voran was reviewing reports from his conquered territories when the first warning came through. His sensor officer reported unusual readings from the border regions. Something was approaching through fold space, something massive. Keth Voran dismissed the concern at first. The humans had no significant fleet. His intelligence officers had confirmed this many times. Whatever was coming must be a natural phenomenon, or perhaps a malfunction in the detection equipment. Then the human ships arrived, and Keth Voran learned how wrong his intelligence officers had been. The first wave emerged from fold space like a wall of metal and fire. 50,000 dreadnoughts appeared in perfect formation, each one bristling with weapons that the Velethri had never seen before. Behind them came more ships, and more after that. The sensor displays on Velethri warships began to overload as they tried to count the incoming vessels. The numbers kept climbing higher and higher until they became meaningless. Commodore Derek Palmer commanded the vanguard of the Terran fleet. He was a man of 45 with a shaved head and the kind of calm demeanor that commanders needed in moments of chaos. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the TDN Thunderchild, and watched his tactical display with satisfaction. The first Velethri defensive line was directly ahead. It consisted of 3,000 warships that had been positioned to guard against any human counterattack. Those ships were now hopelessly outnumbered. Derek opened a channel to all ships in his task force. His orders were clear and simple. Engage and destroy all enemy military vessels. Avoid civilian targets. Take prisoners when possible. Show no mercy to those who resist, but do not become monsters in the process. Humanity had not started this war, but they would finish it with their honor intact. The battle began with a fury that neither side had ever witnessed. Terran Dreadnoughts opened fire with plasma cannons and missile batteries that overwhelmed Velethri shields in seconds. The alien warships returned fire, but their weapons seemed almost primitive against the technology humanity had developed in secret. Ships that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries were torn apart like paper in a storm. Lieutenant Megan Torres flew a fighter in the chaos of the battlefield. She was 28 years old with quick reflexes and a talent for combat flying that had made her one of the best pilots in the fleet. Her squadron was assigned to protect the capital ships from enemy bombers and strike craft. She twisted her fighter through a maze of debris and weapons fire, hunting for targets. A Velethri cruiser loomed ahead of her, damaged but still fighting. Megan watched as 3 Terran Dreadnoughts concentrated their fire on the alien vessel. The shields flickered and failed. The hull buckled under impacts that would have destroyed smaller ships instantly. Then the cruiser came apart in a bloom of fire and metal that scattered across the void. Megan flew through the debris field without slowing down, already searching for her next target. The Battle of the Border, as it would later be called, lasted less than 4 hours. The 3,000 Velethri ships were annihilated. Not defeated or scattered, but completely destroyed. Only a handful of escape pods remained, carrying survivors who would spend the rest of their lives wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Admiral Keth Voran received the reports with growing horror. His defensive line was gone. His reinforcement fleet was too far away to help, and the human armada was still advancing, growing larger with every passing hour as more task forces joined the invasion. He sent urgent messages to the High Council demanding more ships and more resources. The responses he received were confused and frightened. The Dominion had never faced anything like this before. The human fleet pushed deeper into Velethri territory. They struck military installations and shipyards with surgical precision. They destroyed communication relays and supply depots. They captured strategic positions and fortified them against counterattack. Each battle was shorter than the last because the Velethri simply did not have enough ships to mount an effective defense. Commander Daniel Hayes participated in the assault on a Velethri naval base orbiting a gas giant. The Resolute was part of a strike force tasked with eliminating the defensive batteries that protected the facility. He watched through his viewport as Terran ships dismantled defenses that had been built over centuries. The aliens fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against overwhelming firepower. Catherine Moore reported that enemy ships were attempting to flee the system. Daniel gave orders to let them go. Those fleeing vessels would spread word of what had happened here. They would tell other Velethri commanders about the endless waves of human dreadnoughts. Fear was a weapon too, and humanity intended to use it. The war reached the Velethri homeworld in 3 months. Admiral Keth Voran had retreated there with the remnants of his fleet, hoping to make a final stand at the heart of the Dominion. He had gathered every ship he could find. Nearly 40,000 vessels representing the last military strength of his people. It was the largest defensive force the Velethri had ever assembled in one place. The Terran Armada arrived with 400,000 ships. The final battle lasted 6 hours. Keth Voran fought with everything he had. He ordered desperate charges and suicidal attacks. He threw wave after wave of fighters at the human fleet. Nothing worked. The Terran ships advanced methodically, destroying everything in their path with cold efficiency. By the end, the once proud Velethri fleet had been reduced to drifting wreckage, orbiting a world that no longer had the power to defend itself. Commodore Derek Palmer broadcast a message to the planet below. His words were translated into every Velethri language and transmitted on all channels. He said that the war was over. He said that the Velethri military no longer existed as a fighting force. He said that humanity had no desire to harm civilians and would not bombard population centers. But he also said that any further resistance would be met with total destruction. The choice belonged to the people of the Dominion. The Velethri High Council surrendered 12 hours later. They had no other option. The species that they had called weak and fragile had crushed them so completely that recovery was impossible. The empire that had ruled the Orion Spur for 12,000 years had fallen in 90 days. The Dark Armada had done its work, and now a different kind of battle would begin. The galaxy waited for humanity to become conquerors. Every species that had watched the war unfold expected the same pattern they had seen 1,000 times before. The victor would enslave the defeated. They would strip resources and crush any remaining resistance. They would build an empire on the bones of their enemies. This was how things had always been done. This was how power worked among the stars. Humanity surprised them all. Fleet Admiral Gregory Santos stood before the Galactic Assembly 3 weeks after the Velethri surrender. The assembly was a gathering of representatives from 400 different species, a forum where civilizations discussed trade and treaties and the balance of power. They had watched the war with a mixture of terror and fascination. Now they watched the human admiral with expressions that ranged from fear to confusion. Gregory spoke simply and directly. He said that humanity had not come to the stars seeking war. They had not built their fleet because they wanted to conquer other species. They had built it because history had taught them that peace often required strength. The Velethri had murdered 40 million innocent people without warning or provocation. Humanity had responded by eliminating the threat. But now that the threat was gone, there was no reason to continue fighting. He announced that the Terran Republic would not annex Velethri territory. They would not demand tribute or slaves. They would not install puppet governments or strip the defeated empire of its resources. Instead, humanity would help rebuild what the war had destroyed. They would provide food and medicine and engineering assistance to populations that were suffering. They would treat prisoners of war with dignity and return them to their families. The assembly members did not know how to react. Some thought it was a trick, a clever deception designed to lower defenses before a second wave of attacks. Others believed the humans were simply too soft-hearted to do what needed to be done. Very few understood the truth. Humanity had proven their strength beyond any doubt. They did not need to prove it again through cruelty. Captain Christopher Lane was assigned to lead humanitarian operations on the Velethri homeworld. He was a man of 38, with a calm manner and a talent for logistics that made him perfect for the job. His task force included medical ships, cargo vessels loaded with supplies, and engineering teams ready to repair damaged infrastructure. They arrived in orbit above a world that had expected destruction and instead received help. The first days were difficult. The Velethri population had been told for generations that humans were primitive and dangerous. They had been told that the soft creatures from the blue planet were barely intelligent enough to tie their own shoes. Now those same creatures were landing on their world with food for the hungry and medicine for the sick. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to bear. Christopher walked through a refugee camp on the outskirts of a major city. The camp housed Velethri civilians who had fled the fighting and lost their homes. They watched him with four-armed bodies tensed for violence, waiting for the punishment they believed they deserved. Christopher smiled at them and handed out blankets. He directed his medical teams to treat the injured and the ill. He showed them through his actions that humanity was not what they had been told. Commander Amanda Scott handled prisoner exchanges on a space station that had been converted into a processing center. She was a woman with sharp eyes and a gift for languages that allowed her to communicate with the Velethri without relying entirely on translation devices. Thousands of captured soldiers passed through her station, and she made sure each one was fed and treated fairly before being returned to their people. One Velethri officer stopped to speak with her before leaving. He was an older male, with gray skin marked by scars from decades of warfare. He asked her the question that so many of his people were asking. He wanted to know why. The humans could do anything they wanted to the defeated Dominion. They could take revenge for the 40 million dead. They could enslave his species and work them to death in mines and factories. Instead, they were giving away food and rebuilding hospitals. It made no sense to him. Amanda considered her answer carefully. She said that strength without compassion was just cruelty with better weapons. Humanity had wanted to prove they could defend themselves. Not that they could be as brutal as their enemies. They had shown the galaxy what happened when you pushed them too far. Now they were showing the galaxy what kind of people they truly were. The war was the warning. The peace was the choice. The officer was silent for a long moment. Then he bowed his head in a gesture of respect that Amanda had never seen a Velethri make to anyone. He said that his people had been wrong about humans. He said that perhaps they had been wrong about many things. He left the station with something in his eyes that might have been hope. On Earth, the memorials to the dead were being completed. Every major city had a monument to the 40 million who had died in the initial attack. Their names were carved into black stone or projected in light displays that could be seen from orbit. President Caroline Webb attended the dedication ceremony in New York and spoke about the cost of the war and the meaning of the peace that followed. She said that humanity had not won because they were stronger or more violent than their enemies. They had won because they were more determined. They had won because they refused to accept extinction. And they had proven their worth, not through the destruction they caused, but through the mercy they showed afterward. The Velethri had called humans fragile. Now they understood that fragility and weakness were not the same thing. Across the former Dominion, the process of reconstruction continued. Human engineers worked alongside Velethri technicians to repair power systems and water treatment plants. Human doctors taught Velethri medical students techniques that could save thousands of lives. Human ships patrolled trade routes to protect merchant vessels from pirates who might take advantage of the chaos. Slowly, carefully, two species that had been at war began to learn how to live in peace. The reckoning had come and gone. The punishment for the crimes against humanity had been the destruction of an empire. The reward for that destruction was something far more valuable than territory or resources. It was respect, it was fear, and for those who looked closely enough, it was something that might one day become friendship. 10 years had passed since the war that changed everything. The galaxy was a different place now. The Velethri Dominion existed only in history books, replaced by a collection of independent systems that governed themselves under the watchful protection of the Terran Republic. Other empires that had once threatened smaller species now thought carefully before raising their weapons. Everyone remembered what had happened to the last civilization that underestimated humanity. Admiral Samantha Ellis commanded the peacekeeping fleet that patrolled the former Dominion territories. She had been promoted many times since the war, and now controlled more firepower than most species possessed in their entire military. Her flagship was the TDN Horizon, a dreadnought that served as both a symbol of human power and a guardian of the peace they had established. She stood on its bridge and watched a convoy of merchant ships pass safely through space that had once been a war zone. Lieutenant Tyler Brooks was her aide, a young officer who had been born after the war ended and knew it only from history lessons. He stood beside her and observed the peaceful scene with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something more thoughtful. He said that they had scared the entire galaxy. He said that some species were still terrified of humanity even after a decade of peace. He asked if that was really what they wanted. Samantha considered the question. She said that fear could prevent wars just as easily as it could start them. As long as the galaxy knew what happened when someone cornered humanity, maybe they would think twice before trying. The fleet was not just a weapon. It was a deterrent, a promise of consequences that made aggressive species hesitate. Peace through strength was an old idea, but it worked. On Earth, the world had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The economy had shifted to support the massive fleet that still patrolled the stars. Entire generations had grown up knowing that their species was a major power in galactic affairs. Children learned about the war in school, not as a celebration of victory but as a lesson about the costs of violence and the responsibilities of power. The memorials to the 40 million dead remained in every city, permanent reminders of why the fleet existed and why it must never be needed again. President Benjamin Cole stood at the main memorial in Geneva for the 10th anniversary commemoration. He was a man in his 50s who had served as a junior officer during the war and still remembered the fear and determination of those days. Crowds gathered to hear his words, and billions more watched through broadcasts that reached every human world and beyond. He spoke about the species that had called humanity fragile. He talked about how the Velethri had looked at human bodies and seen only weakness. They had seen creatures that bled easily and died quickly. They had seen short lifespans and soft skin and concluded that these beings were not worth respecting. They had been terribly wrong. Benjamin said that humans were fragile. This was simply a fact. They could be killed by accidents and diseases and violence. They lived brief lives compared to many other species. But fragility was not the same as weakness. Fragile things learned to protect themselves. They built walls and weapons and alliances. They prepared for dangers that might never come because they knew that survival favored the prepared. The Velethri had confused human restraint for human inability. They had learned the truth in fire and blood. He concluded by saying that 500,000 dreadnoughts had not won the war. Ships were just tools, metal, and energy shaped into useful forms. What had won the war was the stubborn refusal of a species to accept extinction. It was the determination of billions of people who had decided together that they would not be victims. It was the labor of generations who had built in secret and waited in patience for a day they hoped would never come. And now, a decade later, it was the choice to use that power wisely, rather than cruelly, that defined who humanity truly was. In the depths of space, far from any star, the patrols continued. Terran warships moved through the darkness in formations that covered thousands of light-years. They watched for threats that might emerge from the unknown. They protected trade routes and responded to distress calls from species that had once feared them. They had become guardians rather than conquerors. A role that many humans found surprising but appropriate. Commander Daniel Hayes had retired from active service 5 years after the war. The loss of his sister and her family had never stopped hurting, but time had dulled the sharpest edges of that pain. He lived now on a small colony world with his wife, a woman named Rebecca whom he had met during the reconstruction efforts. They had 2 children who would grow up in a galaxy that was safer because of what their father's generation had done. Catherine Moore visited them sometimes. She had risen to the rank of captain and commanded her own ship now, carrying on the work they had started together. She sat with Daniel on his porch and watched the stars come out as evening fell. She said that the Velethri survivors were finally starting to trust humans. She said that young Velethri were learning human languages and studying human culture. She said that some of them were even applying to serve in combined peacekeeping units alongside human officers. Daniel smiled at this news. He said that was good. He said that winning the war had been necessary. But winning the peace was what mattered in the end. Empires built on fear alone eventually crumbled. What they were building now, slowly and carefully, was something that might actually last. In the Galactic Assembly, humanity had become a voice for smaller species that could not defend themselves. They used their influence to negotiate fair treaties and prevent exploitation. They spoke against aggression and supported cooperation. They were not perfect, and they made mistakes like any other species. But they tried to be better than what they had faced. They tried to create the kind of galaxy they wished had existed when they first ventured beyond their own solar system. The stars had once seemed cold and dangerous, filled with species that would destroy humanity without a second thought. Now, those same stars were beginning to feel like home. Human ships traveled freely between worlds that had never heard of Earth a generation ago. Human traders and diplomats and scientists worked alongside aliens who had become friends and partners. The war that was supposed to end humanity had instead given them a place among the great powers of the galaxy. They had thought humans were fragile, and they had been right. But they had also thought that fragile meant weak. And in that they had been terribly wrong. Humanity had taken their fragility and turned it into a reason to be strong. They had built their fleet and trained their soldiers and waited for the day when someone would test their resolve. When that day came, they had answered with overwhelming force and then surprising mercy. The galaxy would not forget this lesson for a very long time. A new dawn had risen over the stars, and humanity walked proudly into its light.